Today, the world's wealthiest elites will drop millions of dollars just to park a supercar with a Raging Bull emblem in their climate-controlled garages. Its creator couldn't even afford a decent pair of shoes. At his lowest, he was chewing on moldy bread in a dilapidated prisoner of war camp, facing the soul-crushing loss of his beloved wife and fighting to survive in the mud and scrap metal. April 28, 1916. Ferruccio Lamborghini was born in Renazzo, a remote village in northern Italy. It was a brutal era. World War I was dragging Europe into the abyss, Italy's economy was collapsing, and starvation was an everyday reality. Ferruccio's parents were grape farmers at the absolute bottom of the social ladder. Back then, a farmer's child didn't get to choose their destiny. As the eldest son, Ferruccio's fate was sealed at birth. Break his back working that barren land until the day he died, just to keep his 4 younger siblings from starving. But this mud-covered kid fiercely rejected farming. He would rather endure his father's screaming matches than stay out of the manure-scented barn. Why? Because inside sat a beat-up, second-hand tractor his father had mortgaged everything to buy. It was a piece of junk that broke down constantly. But to Ferruccio, those grease-caked gears were 10,000 times more captivating than the grapevines. He had no money for books and no teachers. He learned purely by tearing that machine apart and putting it back together with his calloused hands. When his father saw his son, who was supposed to be working the fields, covered in motor oil, violent arguments erupted. It was a desperate clash of 2 generations, a father needing a laborer to keep the family from starving, and a son desperate to escape the mud. Eventually, looking into his son's fanatic eyes, his father gave in. Ferruccio scraped together whatever loose change the family had, walked out of the village, sat in on classes at a cheap technical school, and eventually became a lowly blacksmith's apprentice. But a poor man never controls his own destiny. In 1940, World War II exploded. Ferruccio had no money to buy his way out. He was drafted, thrown into uniform, and shipped off to the Greek island of Rhodes as a mechanic for the Italian Royal Air Force. It was a living hell. The Mediterranean front was starved for supplies. No rations, no factory parts. Every day, trucks and generators, blown to pieces, were dragged back to camp. The commanding officer's orders were blunt: fix it or face a court-martial. Inside this human meat grinder, Ferruccio's sheer will to survive forced him to work miracles. Armed with nothing but a hammer and a wrench, he scavenged parts from dead vehicles and literally beat scrap metal back into running machines. In 1945, the Axis powers fell. Ferruccio didn't get a hero's welcome. He was thrown straight into a British prisoner of war camp. Behind barbed wire, this emaciated Italian kid only managed to earn a full meal by fixing trucks for his captors. When he finally survived the POW camp and dragged his broken body back to Italy, he wasn't met with hope. He was met with a country bombed to rubble and an economy completely paralyzed. But in his darkest hour, he met a girl named Clelia. They fell in love and got married in slum-like conditions. A sliver of light finally seemed to break through the darkness. But in 1947, that light was ruthlessly snuffed out. Ferruccio was pacing outside the delivery room, anxiously awaiting the birth of his first child. When the doctor emerged, the news shattered him. The baby boy survived, but his wife, Clelia, had succumbed to severe hemorrhaging and exhaustion. She closed her eyes forever. This tough survivor of the war completely broke down. He was now a widower with a crying newborn, and he couldn't even scrape together enough coins to buy baby formula. To keep from losing his mind, and to keep his son from starving, Ferruccio turned into a walking zombie. He locked himself in a drafty, run-down garage and pounded on scavenged scrap metal day and night. Until one day, his father arrived from the village with devastating news. The family tractor was dead. Rural Italy was starving. Farmers desperately needed to resume production, but brand-new tractors were obscenely expensive. Even wealthy landowners couldn't afford them, let alone poor farmers. Worse yet, post-war gasoline prices had skyrocketed. Even if you had a machine, you couldn't afford the gas. Looking at his desperate father, Ferruccio stood under the flickering bulb of his garage, staring at a pile of scrap steel. Suddenly, an insane idea hit him. He took out loan shark debt, even convincing his father to mortgage the family farm to the bank. Clinging to a wad of crumpled bills, he rushed to a government war surplus yard. Buying by the pound like a junk dealer, he hauled back an entire truckload of British Morris military engines. In that primitive workshop, this grieving widower literally welded war garbage into agricultural tractors with his bare hands. To solve the fuel crisis, he tapped into his POW camp ingenuity. He built a dual-fuel vaporizer. The tractor would start using a tiny drop of expensive gasoline, and once the engine was warm, it immediately switched to dirt-cheap diesel. This rough, unpainted Frankenstein machine, dubbed the Carioca, became a lifeline for Italian farmers. It was incredibly cheap and practically indestructible. Farmers lined up outside his run-down garage, clutching their hard-earned pennies to buy one. In just a few years, this farm boy trying to earn milk money for his son experienced an explosive rise in class. His tractor factory expanded aggressively, wiping out his debts and turning him into one of Italy's wealthiest industrial titans. When a poor kid suddenly comes into unimaginable wealth, the first thing he does is try to buy the luxuries once reserved for royalty, just to prove he's no longer that mud-covered POW. Ferruccio bought the most expensive, prestigious sports car in the world, a Ferrari 250 GT. But he never expected that this astronomical purchase would lead to the greatest class-based humiliation of his life. The Ferrari was a nightmare to drive, and the clutch burned out constantly. Relying on his mechanic's intuition, Ferruccio ordered his men to tear it apart. When the gearbox was opened, the former POW felt a wave of sheer absurdity. The clutch in this elite sports car was the exact same €10 commercial clutch used in his tractors. Yet, Ferrari was charging him a flat €1,000 for every repair. Driven by a blue-collar sense of fairness, Ferruccio drove to Ferrari headquarters in Maranello, intending to discuss a design improvement with founder Enzo Ferrari. Enzo Ferrari was revered as the god of racing, aloof and untouchable. When he saw this tractor boss, who, despite wearing a suit, still carried the rough edges of a country bumpkin, Enzo's eyes filled with supreme contempt. He didn't even glance at the burnt part. Instead, he delivered a cold, piercing insult. "Ferrari is perfect. You are a tractor farmer covered in cow dung. You don't deserve to drive a sports car, and you wouldn't know how anyway. Go back to building your tractors." For a moment, the office was dead silent. Enzo's words landed like a vicious slap to the face, ripping open the scars of Ferruccio's entire life. In the eyes of this aristocrat, no matter how much money Ferruccio made, he would always be a lowly peasant. Ferruccio didn't argue. He turned and walked out. But the moment he stepped through those doors, the madman who had survived the POW camps woke up. "If you look down on the poor man from the mud, then I will use the strength forged in that mud to build a machine that crushes you aristocrats to dust." He returned to his factory. He didn't have old money pedigree, but he had a hustler's ruthlessness. He threw down massive checks and poached Giotto Bizzarini, Ferrari's recently fired chief engineer, along with a crew of brilliant underdog mechanics, mostly in their 20s. His mandate was brutally simple. Build me a V12 sports car. Every single part must be better than Ferrari. If you can't, you're all fired. After 4 months of grueling, sleep-deprived labor, Lamborghini's first prototype, the 350 GTV, made a stunning debut at the 1963 Turin Auto Show. But what nobody knew was that the engine was too big to fit under the hood. So, Ferruccio ordered his workers to stuff the engine bay with ceramic bricks for weight distribution and permanently lock the hood. This gambler from the dirt pulled off a legendary bluff, fooling the entire aristocratic auto world. Soon after, the production car rolled off the line, perfectly curing every headache Ferrari had. But Ferruccio's young engineers wanted blood. Working in the dark corners of the factory after hours, they made a treasonous decision. Take the mid-engine layout, reserved strictly for Formula One, and shove it into a street car. When they placed this impossibly low, monstrous chassis in front of Ferruccio, he knew the kill shot had arrived. At the 1966 Geneva Motor Show, the legendary Miura was unleashed. It shattered the 170 miles per hour barrier. Its mind-blowing mid-engine design instantly turned Ferrari's expensive front-engine cars into archaic garbage. The tractor mechanic, who was told to go back to the country, used raw, violent mechanical supremacy to kick the godfather of racing off his throne. The world's billionaires and rock stars lined up with blank checks just to own a farmer's sports car bearing the Raging Bull. However, just as this kid from the bottom was reaching the absolute pinnacle of his life, fate swung its scythe again. In the early 1970s, the Bolivian government placed a massive order for 5,000 tractors. Ferruccio borrowed heavily to expand the factory. But right before delivery, a military coup in Bolivia led the new government to tear up the contract. Thousands of heavy machines rotted at the port. His cash flow snapped instantly. Then, the 1973 global oil crisis hit. Gas prices tripled. In an era where people were struggling to afford food, a V12 supercar was useless scrap metal. Lamborghini plummeted from the clouds straight into bankruptcy. Facing aggressive banks demanding their money, Ferruccio looked at the thousands of blue-collar workers in his factory relying on him to feed their families. He knew what it meant to starve. To protect the livelihoods of his workers, this tough guy made an agonizing, tragic choice. He personally sold off the tractor factory, his life's work, his foundation. A year later, he sold his last shares in the auto company. He was out, with nothing. After losing all his chips at the capitalist table, the 58-year-old Ferruccio didn't jump off a building in despair. The greatest skill of a kid born into poverty is knowing how to survive a fall. He took off his designer suits and put back on the same worn-out work clothes from 40 years ago. He moved to the countryside in central Italy and bought a cheap estate. The man who had used a V12 engine to drive Ferrari to the edge of a cliff spent his twilight years driving an old tractor, planting grapes in the mud. He no longer built the fastest cars in the world. He peacefully made a cheap, rustic wine he named Blood of the Miura. As for the car company he sold, it survived through endless bankruptcies and buyouts until the German Volkswagen Group acquired it, propelling it back to its multi-billion-dollar valuation today. In 1993, the farm boy who once chewed on moldy bread in a POW camp passed away peacefully from a heart attack. At his funeral, an endless convoy of roaring Lamborghini supercars and black smoke-spewing tractors escorted him on his final ride. Today, Lamborghini remains the ultimate symbol of madness and rebellion in the automotive world. If it hadn't been for that bitter winter when he couldn't afford baby formula, if it hadn't been for that arrogant, aristocratic insult, Ferruccio Lamborghini might have just been an obscure, retired mechanic. But the trajectory of his life proved one brutal truth. When you are at the absolute bottom of society, facing the contempt of untouchable elites, the best response is never to bow your head and accept your fate. It's to claw your way out of the mud, use your grease and blood-stained hands to build a monster far more vicious than they are, and then crush them under your boots.